Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Louis Passfield. And Dr. Passfield started his career quite a while ago, back in 1987, right around the time where I was born. In his undergraduate, he studied the Konkani heart rate deflection point. Sorry for the burn off the start. But after his undergraduate degree, he did what probably a lot of people wanted to do and worked with the British cycling team. So it's really neat to see someone come from their undergraduate degree and immediately go on to work with a high-end athletics team. And he did this from 1990 to 1996 and worked as a sports scientist, where he was one of the first people to fit power meters to the bike and get some data on the amount of power that elite cyclists are producing. And from this work that he did back in about 1992, he actually published some of the findings later in 1999 on the 1 hour race. And so for those of you who do not know what that is, it's where cyclists attempt to cycle as far as they possibly can in 1 hour. And this is often known as one of the most painful cycling experiences. So it's probably that his participants didn't like him too much during that time. Probably even less so than the neuromuscular fatigue lab here at USC. So after his time with British cycling, he completed his PhD at the University of Brighton from 1996 to 1998, which is a lot faster than some of the PhD students here. Sorry, that's gonna hurt a lot of people in here. And while he was there, he studied the effects of endurance cycling on gross efficiency and maximal muscle function, and we might see a bit of that here today. So Louis gave me a pretty humble bio sketch, and I had to dig down a bit deeper. And in addition to his high H-index and his large CV and high citation count, the one thing I found really interesting is that Louis also does a number of these outreach videos and to lay public and general cyclists, in addition to researcher or his researcher community in exercise physiology. And with a quick search on YouTube, that his videos have over 1 million views, and which is a lot. And in one of his videos, I kid you not, it has him pop out of a tea mug or teacup as a genie. And if you think I'm BSing you, go and search 5 cycling training myths tackled with Professor Louis Passfield. So in addition to being a genie in his spare time, Dr. Passfield has also done some amazing magical things, such as running 80 miles on the South Downway Trail in the UK, which is a footpath that goes along some rolling hills, if I understand correctly, which is probably quite difficult. And he managed to do it in 17 and a half hours. So without further ado and further burns to the PhD students, today Dr. Passfield will talk about the effect of 2-hour cycling and recovery on efficiency and isokinetic peak power. The floor is yours.
Mike, thank you very much. I've never had an introduction like that before. Wow. I think I'd like to sit down now, and not just because I did my PhD so many years ago. In the UK, it's custom to start a meeting with what we call apologies, basically for absences. And I always found that I had a colleague who'd say, "Any apologies?" And she'd say, "Yes, sorry." Sorry to everybody. And I kind of feel like starting off with an apology today as well, because actually in Mike's introduction, he did allude to exactly the stuff that I'm going to talk about today, which is actually some data from my PhD back in 1996, 97, that I've never published. And I would think, I'm really curious to return to it. This seemed like a great opportunity to do that, to talk about something I'm really kind of passionate and interested about. But also because I'm curious to see whether you guys actually have some further insights based on what's happened in the last 20 or so years since I first conducted that study, in terms of what might be happening. And also, if it's still a concurrent area of research interest, then there may be the scope and the interest here to move things forwards a little bit beyond that. So what I'm going to look at is the effects of, or come to, will be the effects of prolonged cycling. So in this case, 2 hours, and also the recovery time period as well. And I suspect that that's the bit that, particularly in terms of cycling efficiency, is still relatively novel. That I don't think I've seen any studies subsequently that have looked at the recovery time course. And that's the bit that might also make this quite interesting or insightful going forwards. So those of you that know me know my kind of background is in cycling. I often introduce myself as saying, I wanted to be that Brit in the yellow jersey in the Tour de France, but kinesiology let me down. It didn't give me the answers I needed from the training point of view, so I couldn't transform myself into somebody like this. And in the process, it also revealed to me that I lacked the talent. So even if we did have the right training, I still wasn't going to beat this guy to getting on the podium and be a Brit wearing the yellow jersey. But what I was fortunate enough to find myself at was an Olympic training camp shortly after graduating. So tremendous privilege. But I was there as a scientist rather than as the athlete. But it also then started me on a kind of lifelong journey of kind of sort of personal reflection and also observation, trying to link what I understood from a scientific perspective, talking to my colleagues, going to conferences, and delving wherever I could into the work of real leaders in their fields, which I don't claim to be, but then trying to make sense of that in the real world as well. And what I was fascinated about in that time in particular was particularly road events. And in this day and age now, we're talking 1990, you were really smart if you could put a wireless heart rate monitor on somebody and gather data whilst they're riding their bicycles outside. That's the level of technology that we were at in those kind of days. So wondering what it took to become an elite road cyclist was something that was really quite interesting to me. And one of my greatest sort of sources of inspiration or guidance in terms of what determines endurance performance in cycling was Ed Coyle's study from 1988 called The Determinants of Endurance. And he measured a group of well-trained cyclists in his lab, and their endurance exercise was 1 hour approximately time to exhaustion trial. And what he showed was that if all the guys in the study had a very similar VO2 max, and he showed that if your lactate threshold was at a high percentage of your VO2 max, your time to exhaustion was pretty good, and you could go for around about an hour. But if your lactate threshold was quite low as a percentage of your VO2 max, then you would only last for 15 or 20 minutes. And this had very, very strong explanatory power in his particular study. But in terms of endurance physiology, that was really about it, and certainly as far as cycling was concerned at that time. And so I was just a little skeptical that it could be quite that simple in terms of prolonged exercise. And also, I knew from trying to do this kind of thing that there were lots of sensations and experiences I had during prolonged cycling that didn't really seem to match up with some of the classic arguments around physiology. So I was just kind of naturally curious in this area, but so some of that's relevant background, some of it's just trivial information. But what it led me to doing was to then kind of doing a reconstruction of Coyle's study with some local volunteers. And actually, if there was anything that made me unpopular in the lab, it was this study that I'm not going to explain in any more detail than just this anecdote now. But I wanted to get people properly tired in the lab. So I got them to cycle for 3 hours in the lab on a static trainer. And then, of course, I needed to know how they were feeling after 3 hours. So I got them to do a VO2 max test as well. So, and surprisingly, actually, sorry, just realizing where this is going. Not quite how it sounds, but one of the riders that subsequently emigrated. He's in Canada. He's actually what he was for a while, the cycle coach for the Canadian cycling team, the track team. He lives in Vancouver now, Richard Wools. And so that was actually when I first connected with Richard, and he still speaks to me today, which is very kind of him. Not least because he was also the best rider in the study as well. So the interesting thing about this was that here I had a kind of little model where I was trying to evaluate what's the consequences of doing a reasonably sustained bout of exercise, the kind of thing that any serious cyclist might entertain, as opposed to the kind of thing that was typically conducted in the lab, where most people wouldn't even bother to get changed to get on their bike to ride for that length of time, kind of thing. If it's 15, 20 minutes, really, most endurance cyclists weren't interested at all. So that's kind of where I started from. And then what I stumbled on by accident as a consequence of that study was I was curious to see whether their rates of carbohydrate oxidation during the 3 hours might in some way predict how much their performance fell at the end. And as a consequence of doing that, I also then had cycling efficiency data, because it's only one more step to go from energy expenditure to how efficient they were. And surprisingly, I saw a pattern emerge in the data. And at this point, I recognized I was just fishing around the data, so I was a little skeptical and cautious. But nonetheless, it was interesting. And essentially what I found was that at the start of the 3 hours, people's efficiency was a little all over the place, a little scattergun, just as you might expect from measuring, I think it was about 10 different individuals. But after 3 hours, a kind of order had emerged, whereas some people's efficiency had hardly shifted over the 3 hours, and other people's efficiency had dropped quite a lot. And the change in efficiency that I could approximate from my data, because I hadn't designed the study to do this, the change in the efficiency corresponded with how much their power output in the VO2 max test at the end shifted as well. Now, it was all, as I say, rather rough, somewhat back of the envelope and totally unexpected. So I kind of thought this is interesting, but I didn't necessarily kind of place too much stock in it. But all of the other part of their story was the things that I had expected to explain performance very well, like the lactate threshold, percentage of maximum, which Coyle had said was an important determinant of endurance, nothing at all. No relationship observable whatsoever. So I was kind of really surprised by this. So that's my kind of preamble to kind of how this whole story kicks off. So then what I want to do is just pick on a couple of different themes before I go into the study itself. And the first thing is about the measure of cycling efficiency. So I won't bore you with the details of how you do it, but just to say that in starting research in this area, I kind of set about to measure cycling efficiency as accurately as I reasonably could within the laboratory. And that meant doing away with online gas analyzers, because notoriously the data you get from them is a little bit more variable than if you use a Douglas bag. And also with a Douglas bag, you've got that wonderful reassurance that you can calibrate most aspects of that process. You can calibrate your gas analyzers with known gas concentrations. You can calibrate the volume measurements with a syringe, and you can check whether you're drying the gases correctly, and so on and so forth. And we actually subsequently published a study, that there's a bit of a graphic to come in there, looking at the reliability of the Douglas bag method, and based on some of the data that I gathered during my PhD, but also a couple of PhD student that James Hopker and I co-supervised as well for her PhD, where we looked at the reliability of the Douglas bag method. And the reason for pulling this out is that the highlighted columns here, taken from a table, are the number of participants that we had in different studies where we were looking at the effects of cycling efficiency in different studies from our lab. So this was the first one is a longitudinal study on trained cyclists, and there were 14 cyclists, and we showed that gross efficiency increased over the course of a racing season. So presumably as they got fitter, they did something and it improved their efficiency. In this cross-sectional study, we looked at efficiency with 32 cyclists, and then within this one, we did a training intervention and we had 30 cyclists. And all of those studies were conducted with online gas analyzers. If we took the data from this study here and calculated how many participants we'd need if we used Douglas bags, you can see we would need far fewer. So instead of 14, 4, and instead of 32, somewhere around about the 10 mark for each of the different groups. So using Douglas bags to measure gross efficiency makes a big difference in the accuracy you can get with that. And that's potentially important because one of our work around training, the differences in cycling efficiency with training, or as a consequence of comparing trained and untrained individuals, has been criticized, particularly by, oh gosh, what's his name? I've forgotten his name now. Anyway, it's been criticized. And he points to Dr. Bonning, Professor Bonning. He's written a lovely letter in the International Journal of Sports Performance and Physiology, kind of one of those editorial pieces, and he says there are some serious mistakes that sports scientists are making, and one of those mistakes is the assumption that trained cyclists, as we show in these 3 studies here, have higher efficiency than untrained individuals. And our kind of counterpoint is, well, don't necessarily have the statistical power required to measure the difference between trained and untrained. And a lot of the studies that report no difference between trained and untrained don't have great statistical power. And increasingly, of course, they use online gas analyzers rather than Douglas bags. And that's not to dismiss the argument, because he may be correct. I'm not, you know, I'm not sure, but yeah. Well, we have done an informal one, not a proper one, but the problem with that is most of the data showing an effect of trained and untrained comes from our lab. So I think I'm trying to think. One of the Italian labs, who's the guy who's passed away now from the Italian cycling lab? Gosh, I'm really on top form today. Anyway, I think that they've produced one study where they see a difference as well. So one lab in Italy, but most of the data, which suggests there is a difference between the two, has come from Kent, and particularly James Hopker, his PhD, and some of the subsequent work that we've co-supervised together. So that's one of the challenges. Boning cites his 1984 study. And actually, you know, we've looked quite carefully, as you can imagine, at his data, and we think his data even suggests some evidence for a difference between trained and untrained. So, you know, have a look at his study and make your mind up as well on that. It's definitely not perfectly straightforward, though. So, you know, there are occasions when gross efficiency isn't differentiating when you would expect it to as well. But, yeah, it's as I say, it's a fascinating one. I'm not going to go down the trained untrained debate today, but I did want to acknowledge the fact that it is a topic of some controversy. But so the Douglas bag part is an important aspect of that, and I raise that because if this were to go any further forward, we'd need to think about either large numbers of participants like we see on this side, or using a Douglas bag to bring down the number of participants and potentially increase our ability to detect the effects. So that was one part of it. The other part of measuring efficiency, of course, is you want accurate power measurements. And as Mike said in my introduction, I was lucky enough that I'd been one of the first people, at least in the UK, to start using a power meter. And also fortunate that Uli Schoberer, who developed the SRM power meters, has done a great job. So they're pretty accurate devices. And so as part of the preparation for this study, what we was also able to do was to take advantage of some work of a colleague of mine at the University of Brighton had done in developing a device that he mounted on the treadmill, but was actually with a power meter as well. And so with Simon Jones, who went on to become a coach at British Cycling, we did a little study where we used this bicycle on a treadmill, and we basically set it up as a monarch ergometer. And we had the treadmill drive the monarch ergometer. So now I could sit there, 500 watts going through underneath me, measure the power output, and also record the data from the ergometer at the same time and do a dynamic calibration of those two devices. So we knew when we came to measuring the power side of the cycling efficiency that we had pretty accurate measures, and possibly a little more accurate than most people can normally get from an ergometer at that time if you were just using a Monarch or something like that, because you're having to manually count the revs or at least electronically record the revs and make some calculations, whereas we were able to take it directly from the power meter. And I'll come back to this device again in a couple more slides. So as a consequence of all that, the first study I did in my PhD was one where I looked at the changes in cycling efficiency, but now designed intentionally to capture the difference between before and after exercise. And I tried to be reasonably thorough about it. So I'll just give you an outline of the protocol, because this will come up again in a similar theme in a moment. So I had a control condition as well as an exercise condition. In the control condition, people did a 6-minute warm-up, and the intensity that we picked was just 60% or thereabouts of VO2 max. So we're looking at moderate intensity exercise. I can say that because Juan's not here. Otherwise, I know I'd be in trouble. So they warmed up for 6 minutes, and we took an efficiency measure at this point. And then they did a 5-minute all-out performance trial. So we could see how much they could produce, how much work they could do in 5 minutes. Then they rested for 75 minutes in the control condition, and then repeated that same setup again. So they did another 6-minute warm-up, another 5-minute performance trial. And one of the interesting things was from this control group, this is the performance trial for the before exercise, this is the performance trial for the after exercise, and you can see with 75 minutes of recovery in between, they can produce exactly the same performance, more or less. So a nice repeatability in general from a 5-minute all-out performance trial. in a random order, we also got them to do the exercise trial as well. So the same setup again, but now they did the warm-up, the 5-minute performance trial, and then they ride for 75 minutes before repeating the performance trial again. And unsurprisingly, we see that performance has dropped after 75 minutes. So this is a much tighter demonstration of the kind of thing that I've been playing around with in the lab a couple of years before. In general was a little more popular with the participants too. But for me, the thing that was really interesting, of course, the exciting moment for me, because I'd set out to look at this, was then to see what had happened to cycling efficiency when we measured it at this point here and this point here, and how that related to the changes in performance. And what I did was calculate how much efficiency had changed and how much performance had changed, and you can see the relationship here very nicely. So there appears to be some kind of a relationship between changes in performance over a prolonged period of time and efficiency. Now, the reason I'm interested in that is because if people are pedaling more slowly later in exercise, that's hardly unexpected or unsurprising. But the fact that that relates to a change in efficiency might tell us something about the mechanisms of fatigue. I just don't know what it tells us about the mechanisms of fatigue. And the subsequent part of my career has really been looking more at kind of the relationship between efficiency and different levels of performance, not going back to this central question about what is it about exercise that changes efficiency and potentially changes performance as well. So that's why this is fascinating to me, this notion that performance changes when you have exercise in here, whereas you can reproduce the same performance if you don't have exercise in here. So some kind of fatigue or something's happening, and that makes sense to me. You know, the prolonged cycling makes you tired in ways that is difficult to explain by current physiological models, but here we see some kind of a relationship with efficiency, and the changes in that happening too. And when I delved back into literature, what I found was everybody went, oh yeah, we know all about heart rate drift, we know about VO2 drift. And then you would try to look at what the mechanisms were behind it, and actually a lot of the time people were confusing VO2 drift and heart rate drift. Heart rate drift is very simple. During prolonged exercise, you probably dehydrate slightly. Your cardiac output may be compromised very slightly, or at least your stroke volume from the prolonged exercise. And so heart rate gradually changes over time. Body temperature goes up, that might also stimulate heart rate responses. So an increase in heart rate over time is perfectly explicable. An increase in VO2 should only happen because you're metabolizing more fat, and there's a slightly greater oxygen cost to the cost of metabolizing fat. Beyond that, if your oxygen consumption is going up in a way that isn't explained by fat metabolism, then your efficiency has dropped in some way, and that's what we're seeing here, a drop in efficiency. So this is an increase in oxygen consumption that's somewhat inexplicable. The only other thing to keep in mind, of course, is this is whole body measures. So we're measuring at the mouth the response of the whole body. It's not specifically the muscle itself. But there's some indirect evidence to suggest that it may largely be driven by what's happening in the muscle. That's kind of all of the background to where I then started the final study for my PhD, which I'll launch into in just a second. Anything it would be helpful for me to clarify or go back over on what I've just done?
Just to clarify, you're defining efficiency as the oxygen cost produce a certain amount of water.
Exactly, and not simply the VO2. I calculate the caloric equivalent for that oxygen consumption. So we look at RER and make an adjustment based on substrate utilization as well. So there's a range of different formulae you could use for that, but more or less they take you to about the same place. Yeah, exactly. So in other words, if over a period of time you increase your fat metabolism, so your RER drops very slightly, and your VO2 goes up a little bit to compensate for that, that would count as no change in efficiency. So you're seeing an increase in VO2, but it's entirely explained by the increase in fat metabolism. So in terms of efficiency, it would be a real increase in VO2 above that is explained by changing substrate utilization. Thank you. Anything else before I go on? Okay. So one of my speculations at that time, which was probably a little naive, but it was perhaps a reasonably logical one to go on to then, was to think about, well, maybe what's happening, because this is what it feels like, is you just get weaker. Your muscles don't produce the same amount of force after a prolonged period of time in the saddle. At least mine didn't. And so I was interested then to measure peak power output, like just a really short, intense sprint, and see what happened to that, and whether that corresponded with the changes in efficiency that I was looking at as well. The problem with measuring peak power output in the lab, and again, we can explore this because Juan's not here, otherwise he'd disagree with me, is a small aspect of the power velocity curve. So if you do it on a monarch ergometer or any ergometer where you've got a fixed resistance that you're sprinting against, you're also, as fatigue creeps in, fighting against the power velocity curve as well. And sorry, that's the force curve. I just borrowed this one from a previous slide. Here's the power velocity curve. And let's assume, for the sake of argument, that you're conducting this sprint at optimal velocity. So here we are at optimal velocity. You can measure peak power output. Now, if you've got a fixed resistance or a monarch ergometer where it's kind of notionally a variable resistance, and you get tired, you probably don't go quite as far up this curve the next time you do the sprint. In other words, your second sprint might look something like this, with a reduction in power output like that. But that's a disproportionate effect on your peak power output because you haven't had the chance to sprint at your optimal velocity. And as you're not at optimal velocity, you can see your peak power is going to be lower. So one of the difficulties of doing repeat sprint evaluations is ideally you want to conduct them all at the same cadence rather than allowing a variable cadence. Unless, because the other study I'd love to do is one where you could get the whole force velocity curve or power velocity curve in one hit. And potentially with high data sampling, you might be able to do that with an accelerating sprint where you can look at peak power output over a few seconds, but as they accelerate, you can see power increase and then probably drop away as they spin out. So you can get that whole curve in one go. But typically in most situations, we've got people working against a fixed resistance. And so as they get tired, they slide to this side, and then that amplifies the actual decrease in power output. So the way to do that is to have a constant velocity for your cadence when you're sprinting. And that's where our old friend, the bike on the treadmill, comes back in again. Because it had actually been, this isn't a photograph of the actual thing, but imagine that this bike is actually fixed to those rails. So the handlebars don't move. The front wheel isn't necessarily touching the belt at all, only the back wheel, only the back. And then you start the treadmill running. So you can sit on the bike, you can freewheel, and then as soon as you start pedaling, you can only pedal as fast as that belt is going. Because in order to pedal any faster than that, you'd need to make the wheels spin or slip on the belt. So by fixing a bike on a treadmill in this way, you've actually created an isokinetic dynamometer. And even more beautifully, you can freewheel before you start your sprint, so you can do whatever kind of warm-up or exercise you want to do. And then it doesn't matter how hard you pedal, you're only ever going to go as fast as the belt that's been set. And so in that way, you've got an isokinetic dynamometer, which is what, I said, my colleague at the University of Brighton at the time had set up there. So I was able to use that for this particular study. So then we go on to the study itself. And as I say, what I was interested in is looking at those changes in efficiency, but also peak power output as well. And I'm going to present this in two parts, although in essence, they were done, the data gathering was done concurrently. So I had 11 male participants, although they weren't actually football player or soccer players, as you call them here. They were competitive cyclists. And all of the participants in this study, it just so happened, were competitive cyclists. They were regularly racing over 2 hours, or involved in races over 2 hours or more. So they were quite used to this kind of exercise, although they didn't do that during the study data collection period itself. And then they weighed around 70 kilos, 1.8 meters, and on average their VO2 max was 4.4 liters per minute. So it gives you a sense of who the participants were for this. They were all familiarized with each of the measures as well, particularly the isokinetic sprinting. So I kept them doing it until they got some kind of asymptote in their peak power output. And then here's the protocol itself. So we got them to do exercise for 2 hours. And during the 2 hours, they had an initial warm-up period before they did their first sprint, then carried on cycling, another sprint, carried on cycling, another sprint, so on, through to the 2 hours. And you'll notice I've also got a couple of static MVC measures in there as well. But essentially, the key thing I was interested in was trying to see the characteristics of this peak power output, and also then measuring efficiency immediately before each of these sprints as well. And because the ergometer was on the treadmill, but they were pedaling on a Monarch in the lab, there was a couple of minutes break where I moved them from one bike to the other in order to do that study. So that's the kind of the broad setup of the data for the exercise. And then in recovery, I would get them to get back up and ride for 5 minutes so I can measure the efficiency in the 4th and 5th minute before they then did another sprint. So we could look at the following 2 hours to see how their recovery kinetics worked out too. During the study itself, I recorded their rectal temperature. And just a little tip on rectal temperature measurements, because I've had a colleague who's dined out on this for a long time since. One of the local cyclists was unfortunate enough to take the rectal probe I'd given him and the casual instructions I'd given him to the bathroom. And when he came back, I went to plug in the rectal probe only to find that the probe was in my hands, not the plug. So always be careful how you explain that bit to your participants if you're doing rectal temperatures. Luckily, we didn't have to go to accident and emergency and explain why we needed some assistance. We were able to rectify the problem. Obviously, expired gases, used the Douglas bags, the power output with the SRM, heart rate, and I took capillary lactate and blood glucose measures, and also hemoglobin hematocrit as well, and tracked body mass during both the exercise periods and recovery periods, just prior to each of those sprints as well. So this is what I managed to get 11 participants to do this study for me. And this is what their data looked like. Here we see a progressive drop in the cycling efficiency, although somewhat surprisingly, and I'll return to this point in a minute, you can see that their efficiency was fairly level to start with. And had we stopped the study at around the 60, 70 minutes mark of the previous study, we would not have found a significant difference in efficiency over that period of time. But it did dip quite sharply towards the end. And then you can see in recovery, it really recovers quite slowly, such that all of the final value and all of the recovery values for those 11 participants are significantly lower than the initial value. So 2 hours after finishing exercise, where they've only got back up for 5 minutes in that time period, their efficiency is still significantly lower. And that looks like some kind of curvilinear response, and it's leveled out considerably below where they started. So whatever happens to efficiency during prolonged exercise, it does look like it recovers really very slowly. In contrast, peak power output didn't really do very much at all. So there was a significant reduction after 2 hours, but it was of the order of about 50 watts in 1,000. The next measure was not significantly different from the start. 3 hours was lower, and then as you can see again, by the end of that study, there's no significant difference from their initial values. I'm reasonably sure they were motivated because I offered them a prize for the person who generated the highest power output all the way through, and it was, you know, they were all trying to keep tracks on who had done what in order to make sure they were in line for the prize for the peak power output during the study. But of course, that's always a factor with these dynamic forms of exercise. And then as I mentioned, I also measured MVC2, but I wouldn't place too much stock in this. I did use 2 different methods, one actually on the cyclogometer itself, so they had to put the crank in a horizontal position and just push down on it. And this is the data you can see from that, where we do see a small decrease in maximum voluntary force here in that downward pressing position. And I got them to do a leg extension one too, and there was no difference in that one whatsoever. But by now we're talking about several minutes post each bout of exercise, so that's a major confound in this, although I'm really interested in the long-term fatigue effects rather than the acute effects of immediately post-exercise or immediately from exercise. But still, we're seeing something there. And at that time, it was interesting because a couple of people suggested that this doesn't happen at all. You don't see any decline in MVC during, as a consequence of prolonged dynamic exercise. So I said, well, maybe you do, but you have to be quite specific about how you measure it, perhaps. Okay, so that was with 11 participants, and as I said, I presented it in 2 parts. So that's the kind of like the broad take-home message that yes, efficiency does seem to change. It seems to recover really very slowly, and it doesn't seem to track changes in peak power output, which suggests that maybe there are other factors at play here. The other thing I did was 9 of the 11 participants actually agreed to do 2 trials for me. And the reason for having 2 trials was I was quite curious to do some other dietary manipulations to see whether that made a difference to their responses. So the data you've seen for the 11, they actually form the 9 from this trial A here, where they've done their exercise for 2 hours at 60% of VO2 max. During the exercise, they were hydrated with a 50 millimolar sodium solution. So it's quite salty, and I use that because this is a kind of an optimal rehydration solution post-exercise. So you can kind of see where this is going. But no carbohydrate in that, just the sodium itself. But then in recovery, this group had, and so the data you've seen already, they had 1.5 grams of carbohydrate 1.5 grams per kilogram body mass of carbohydrate per hour. So slightly above the recommended rates of required for maximum glycogen resynthesis. And as I said, this is 9 people now we're looking at. In random order or a counterbalance design, so alternately sequenced, these participants also did trial B, and the difference here was during exercise, they voluntarily dehydrated. So if they wanted to just have a little mouthwash or something like that, that was fine, but I asked them to, as much as possible, abstain from fluid intake during exercise. It was just an ambient lab temperature, so it was around about 20 degrees. And then in recovery, what I did was just rehydrate them rather than give them the carbohydrate. So in theory, fluid balance at the end of this is the same, but they haven't had the carbohydrate in recovery. And what you can see is notionally what I'm doing is manipulating glycogen loading here. And you can also see why this study, I hadn't pushed really hard to publish it at the time because it's an unbalanced design. We don't have all the different arms of the study where we have dehydrated and matched carbohydrate intake and so on. It's just two extreme conditions here. As a consequence of those manipulations, though, we can look at what happened. In terms of body weight, during exercise, body weight was consistent for the sodium supplemented group. Obviously, I was weighing them, prescribing their fluid intake, so that worked well. And then they actually gained weight in recovery because they were then taking the carbohydrates post-exercise. Here you can see the dehydration in the group that voluntarily dehydrated, in the trial where they voluntarily dehydrated. So significant differences of around about 2 kilos post-exercise. And then I asked them to rehydrate as fast as they could, but that was the best that they could do. So they got back to their starting body weight, but they weren't able to, so they kind of like superhydrate, which is the recommended strategy for rehydration. But they were able to restore body weight, and that was about as fast as they could do it, but it took them the best part of the 2 hours to do that. In terms of their core temperature, it elicited a significant difference. So in the euhydrated trial, they leveled out at around about 38.5 degrees, whereas they came close to 39 degrees in the dehydration trial. And then you can see actually the pattern reverses slightly in recovery because of that carbohydrate intake, but there's no significant difference in the body temperatures in the recovery period. And these are considerably lower than the exercising temperatures in the exercise period. Heart rate, the difference by the end of exercise was around about 10 beats in heart rate from the dehydration. And as a consequence, there was a variable response in lactate, which was difficult to unpick during exercise. But actually, again, the carbohydrate supplemented group tended to spike a little bit in the recovery period in terms of lactate. So metabolically, that's the kind of first thing we see. In terms of the efficiency, now we're comparing 9 rather than the 11, and it kind of changed the story a little bit because we lost statistical power as well as gaining an extra trial. So we see this where the efficiency was maintained in the fluid supplemented group. For some reason, with a dehydrated group, we see a pretty linear fall in gross efficiency, which is pretty much what I'd expect. And there's a significant drop by the 2 hours of exercise. But the only time where efficiency is different is at this point here, 90 minutes into exercise. Curious whether a sodium solution makes a difference to efficiency or not. I don't really know. At the time, I dug around the literature a little bit. There was one study that suggested really strong sodium solutions like that might be ergogenic. But again, it's not something I've returned to really since. And then in recovery, you can see that both recover slowly. So neither is getting back to where it was before. And there's no significant differences between these two groups in recovery, although there is a trend over time that emerge in the recovery period. So kind of difficult to look at the efficiency data and see whether the manipulation is done very much or at all, but if it has, there's just this more linear fall in the dehydrated exercise condition here. There's a hint that carbohydrate supplementation might make a difference here, but it's all a little bit inconclusive. And certainly, given those effects, it's hard to say whether there's a clear influence from any of those nutritional implications in terms of what's happening with efficiency. And then with peak power output, nothing at all. Didn't really make any difference which condition they were in. Pretty much what you might expect now. It's people were able to reproduce a maximal 6-second sprint very well, both over 2 hours of exercise and then for 2 hours of recovery. Just one other thing before I finish up, which is really quite curious, and that was that because of the design of the study, they rode for 2 hours and then they took some carbohydrates straight away. And then again after an hour in recovery, but they're recovering. But I'm asking them to get back up after 30 minutes of recovery to exercise. This is their RER 30 minutes after taking carbohydrate in recovery. So this is their blood glucose. And look at the difference here. At 30 minutes post-exercise, blood glucose is significantly elevated, but it's not had an impact on RER. It just so happened that Andy Coggan had done a study where they'd said carbohydrate ingestion late in exercise extends endurance performance. I went and looked at his data and it showed exactly the same thing. They'd never commented on it. So whatever it is that regulates carbohydrate oxidation, under those kind of circumstances late in exercise, it's not an elevated blood glucose per se, which is fascinating because these should synchronize and they don't. So I don't quite know what's going on there. It's 30 minutes later before carbohydrate oxidation takes off, or RER, as you can see here, takes off compared with what's happening with blood glucose. So they're completely out of sync, which is really intriguing. So to finish off with, basically from all of that, I conclude, it does look like consistently over several studies, we've seen a drop in gross efficiency. It's hard to know whether there's any specific interventions that make a difference to the speed with that efficiency changes. Perhaps it has a slight influence of the sodium ingestion. It does seem to recover really slowly after exercise. And from a fatiguing point of view, that makes sense because kind of what I was interested in is this sense of when you've done a long ride, your legs are tired afterwards, you know you can't get back on a bike and do exactly the same kind of thing before. But many of the classic models don't seem to explain that, whereas these changes in efficiency seem to match that pattern a little bit more effectively. But I have no idea what's driving the efficiency or determining efficiency under either just like what differentiates it trained from untrained, or in this case, the effects of prolonged exercise itself. But it doesn't look like it's the changes in the force generating capacity of the muscle itself if we infer that from the changes in peak power output from sprints during exercise. Thank you.
All right, any questions for Dr. Passfield? Share it.
Yes, so the same cadence as they did the isokinetic sprint side as well. So we'd spotted that they were all pretty happy pedaling at 88 to 90 RPM. So that's what they had to do, both the sprints and the prolonged exercise at.
Do you think you may have mitigated the change in gross efficiency to allow them to change their cadence?
Right, so you mean if they'd been allowed to change their cadence as the ride progressed, they may have been able to, but possibly. And again, wouldn't it be lovely to do like a force velocity curve to see if that shifts after 2 hours and whether that would match it? Because you might speculate their fibers become more slow-like in characteristics, and therefore maybe their optimal cadence shifts to a lower cadence as well. Yeah, I mean, the difficulty is just looking at the super elite guys. There's no sign that when they're on top of the Tourmalet in the Tour de France or something like that, that they're looking for a particularly lower cadence 2.5 weeks into the Tour de France. So there's obviously some resilience for some people, but yeah, definitely.
Maybe just a follow-up on that. Has there been any work that's looked at kind of the force, the effective to the crane, and tying that to changes in gross efficiency as a person? For example, do you know
yeah, not that I know of. Danilo, do you know of anything that's? I'm sorry, I've woken him up.
People looked at effective force on the crane and changes in gross efficiency.
So So and you probably know, are well aware of this already, Mike. The bit that we do know is that there's not a good correspondence between pedaling effectiveness and gross efficiency. And if you train somebody to pedal more effectively from a mechanical point of view, so we often argue, you know, if you could pedal all the way around the circle, that would be the most effective way of applying the forces. But when you look at metabolic data, it costs more oxygen to do that. So you might be applying the forces in what looked like a more effective way, but it's actually more energetically more inefficient to do that. So the tricky bit here would be saying, well, could those changes in efficiency be due to a lack of coordination that manifests during the ride? But that's a coordination that's not obvious in the initial determinant of efficiency. So that would take a little bit of careful kind of thinking about to design that study. But again, that would be one of those things that would be great to do, look at changes in force application patterns over time. Yeah.
I can't remember the paper, but I've seen somewhere that the production of peak force occurs later in the pedaling stroke.
Oh, and as you fatigue.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
As the exercise
Aha.
continues for a longer period of time.
Yeah.
So
No, I
instead of
haven't.
occurring at like 25 degrees post
Right.
top dead center, it starts drifting to 30.
So that would be interesting to see. To see that and to link that in with EMG data and efficiency data would be fascinating. Was that a study sponsored by Garmin?
No, it wasn't. Yeah, no, it wasn't part of the pedal.
Come on.
Yeah.
So in that one figure, you showed that correlation between drop in performance and changes in gross efficiency.
Yes.
And that was as a percentage. So is that a percentage of the gross efficiency percentage?
It's always difficult to know how to scale an efficiency measure. Yeah, so this was the relative change in gross efficiency. So like if gross efficiency is 20%, a 10% change would be 2% overall absolute value.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was the relative change, not an absolute.
Do you know, and obviously this is older data, but do you remember any of those changes in gross efficiency? So someone changed like 15%. Did they have a higher gross efficiency to start with, or do you remember just in relation to starting efficiency?
No, so because of the unfortunate way I designed that very old study, the very first measurements were taken at 30 minutes into exercise because I was expecting to use it just to estimate carbohydrate and fat metabolism, not to calculate efficiency specifically. And there was no strong relationship between the efficiency measures at 30 minutes and how much their performance changed after 3 hours. So gradually that relationship emerged over the 3-hour period. So it was kind of like the implication was their efficiencies ranged to start with, but then by the end, it was those people that had maintained a higher absolute efficiency that were better able to defend their performance. And interestingly, although that the second study I did where we looked at actual changes in performance and actual changes in efficiency, I did the same analysis, and actually it also came out with a significant correlation. So it suggested that this is a completely different group of people, completely different laboratory, but actually that same pattern where those people with the highest efficiencies at the end of exercise were also the best able to maintain their performance. Yeah, so again, you know, it's kind of, it's not ultra convincing, but it's all kind of pointing in that sort of direction. Yeah. I just wish I knew what determined efficiency and then why it changes during exercise. I'm looking at this man here and he's not giving me any answers at all. I'm thinking,
You obviously took a great deal of care in trying to manage the total amount of fluid
yeah.
in the cyclist. Was part of the thought process that went into that you may be losing fluid in the muscle, and that by then changing the muscle's structural size?
So I would love to tell you that I'd been that smart, but no, it was more just simply to mitigate against kind of global dehydration, if you like, to say, yeah. Well,
did you actually measure people's leg diameter?
I didn't do that. I think what I was really looking at that time was what were the kind of putative mechanisms for this in the literature, given that not people weren't really talking about a change in VO2, muscle VO2 over time anyway. And so dehydration would be one of the points that would come up, and changes in core temperature would be another one, or change in muscle temperature would be another one that came up. I didn't really want to stick needle thermistors into the muscles of my participants, so I inferred it from the core temperature instead.
Yeah, I was just
But,
thinking about that
yeah.
because of the relation. Well, a lot of people claim that the way that creatine monohydrate increases muscular strength is by increasing hydration.
Yes, yeah. Well, certainly, I mean, the little bit of experience I've got with creatine is people put on, what, half to a kilo with creatine supplementation. So I presume that's where that fluid is going.
That's
but
what I've always made more sense to me than it's increasing creatine phosphate.
Andrew, did you look at their performance measure relative to their change in core temperature at all?
No, I haven't done that. It would be easy enough to do that. Yeah. I mean, absolutely. Oh, actually, you know what? No, I can't do that because the data with the performance trials in is the first study, which I didn't measure core temperature in. The second study, we didn't measure performance. We just had the isokinetic peak power outputs and the efficiency. Yeah. We need another study to do that. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't, the changes weren't that extreme. I mean, so they were statistically significant. I think they're physiologically meaningful, but I didn't get a sense that anyone was feeling limited from a temperature perspective. Some of them were starting to feel quite dehydrated by the end. You know, they could feel the effects of, like, they were ready to start drinking, but yeah.
I can see noticeable changes in isometric force.
Yeah. Well, and of course, notionally, that's actually helping support peak power output under those conditions as well, because they're running a little bit hotter. But yeah, no, don't know that.
Glucose stuff you're talking about, just the changes in RER. Anybody look into, say, like fluid dynamics like that, if that's changing like that? Because if you're
So this is going back to sort of around before 2000. At that time, I couldn't find anything at all. I haven't gone back to look now. I'd be amazed if that hasn't been picked up and looked at in much more detail since. Yeah. 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 Well, I just found it fascinating because at that time there were a few people playing around with muscle metabolic responses and doing things like trying to activate pyruvate dehydrogenase and that kind of thing, and looking at the lag in that part. But I thought, here's this massive metabolic stimulus, so this big surging in blood glucose, presumably insulin, although I haven't measured it, and nothing has shifted in the muscle after 30 minutes. You know, even in the transition from rest to exercise, I just found that astounding. And then when I picked up on Coggan's study, I think it's 1986, you go back and look at it, and you go, oh, look, it's the same thing again. They fed them, and their glucose went up, but they didn't actually shift muscle substrate utilization for over 30 minutes afterwards. Completely. I mean, but still, you would have thought something about GLUT4 activation with exercise helping bring glucose in. And I even wondered whether it has to be formed into glycogen before it comes, can enter glycolysis, but that seems a bit unlikely. Yeah. But I don't think this was done in 97. I don't think diabetes was a thing then, so people hadn't really looked at these issues.
Have you seen the? Sorry. Have you seen the radio labeled studies where they look at how long it takes it to expire?
Yeah. But again, I'm going back to some of the really early ones because one of the earliest ones was a study from Noakes where they'd used soluble starch, and they found their tracer went through as glucose really fast, but unfortunately not attached to the soluble starch. So they got completely wrong conclusion from that and had to retract that study. And at that point, then I started to look at other things. So my kind of keeping abreast of that kind of thing I haven't really done. But I imagine someone like Rick Van Loon has done a lot of work in that kind of area.
It seems to show about the same lag from the stuff.
Right.
It takes about 20 minutes.
Yeah. Right. Yes. Yes, yes. So they didn't really. Was it? Oh, here. No, no. It's the previous slide, I think. Here. Yeah. So it was, and this was difficult statistically as well because it was like non-parametric, just what you'd expect from blood lactate responses during exercise, a little bit all over the place. The only thing that was really discernible was at the point where they're taking glucose here, the next bout of exercise is a spike in lactate response during exercise. It's gone back down again, and then they take more glucose here, and it goes back up again. That's the only thing you can really infer clearly from it. It doesn't look like it at all, and there's nothing really that differentiates between these. And I did have the hemoglobin hematocrit measures as well, but I think it was only the thumbprint ones, and it wasn't particularly reliable, so I lost a couple of those anyway. So in the end, I didn't really try and do any plasma volume corrections or anything like that. Yeah. Yes, it did drop. Was that on this slide here? So they're down to just over 3 by the end of exercise. This is whole blood, not lysed, I think it is. So that
I'm just thinking that necessarily indicates that probably the liver is probably getting glucose in, and then if you put glucose in the muscle, you can't reverse that process, so it might be effective mechanism to prevent any further.
Like a rebound, like a hypoglycemic type of response, yeah. But then it's this point here. So glucose has gone up above 5 millimole at that point. But you know, and still nothing's happening within the muscle at that point. That's, you know, it's. How would we regulate that? Like, what would be the connection between the liver and the, you know, when the liver goes, wait a minute, I'm not full yet, you can't use that glucose. Yeah. 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 It's, yeah, no, it's, I mean, it's a shame we don't have the insulin data as well, but I imagine it tracks the glucose data reasonably well. Yeah. Maybe this is something that is easy enough to replicate. Perhaps you don't need to do that amount of work to, you know, once you start to do some prolonged exercise and then go, yeah, yeah. So if you ask Professor Boning, he will say no. I'd say on average, the difference is kind of like if you imagine your average person has an efficiency of 20%, as a highly trained cyclist, maybe 22%, so up to 10%. And we find, like in one of the earlier studies, the variability in one person across the season could be as much as a change of 5%, so from 20 to 21% in the course of a season. Now, your VO2 max won't necessarily change by that much if you're a well-trained cyclist. So notionally, your efficiency is responding more to training than your VO2 max. But that's another debate itself.
Maybe to follow up on that, when they measure that difference, is it they have the untrained cyclists and the trained cyclists cycle at the same wattage, or do they go at the same relative intensity? And how do you kind of?
We've done kind of both of those things, and it's a really tricky one. So the most complete analysis we did was a study which we published in JAP in 2013, where we took 10 untrained young people, 10 untrained older people, 10 trained people, and our young people, 10 trained older people. So we kind of had this little matrix. And then what we did is, because this is a major issue, is because it's essentially a baseline correction that you're worried about. Like if you're untrained and you're made to work at a really high intensity, then that might be a confound.
Yeah.
But equally, you have to consume some oxygen at rest. And if you're untrained and you only go a little bit above your resting, then that resting oxygen cost is a major impact on your overall efficiency. So we've also done analysis where we try to scale that out. And it happened just as we were doing that study on these 40 people. Greg Atkinson had published something about how to scale out this ratio bias, as he called it. And so we used that conversion. So we could basically, we've done studies where they've had people at the same intensity or the same relative intensity. And then in that 2013 study, we also scaled out the effect of the relative intensity. So we kind of took that into account before we did the analysis. And we still see that difference. Again, that's one of the points that Boning seems to have overlooked, because he's very happy to say, well, if you tested trained cyclists, you test them at a higher power output. And we know that efficiency gets better as the power output increases. So all you're doing is testing fitter people at a higher power output and showing they've got a higher efficiency. That's not surprising. We go, no, actually, we see the fact that people tested at the same intensity but train, that improves, and the intensity hasn't shifted. So there's, same cadence, same power output, but with training that's improved. So that's consistent with trained people having a higher efficiency as well. However you try and partial it out.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Could the change in efficiency over the season reflect changing body composition or changing composition of the leg itself?
It could do, and we've shown a difference in sexes because from what we think is that. So we did leg volume measurements and showed that there is some kind of relationship between leg volume and efficiency, because of course this is kind of partially a rotating mass as well, and therefore a difference between males and females. But we've also, where was I going with this? In terms of the efficiency measures themselves, one of the studies we did, we took a group of cyclists and trained them. And James had speculated that the benefit of the racing period was the high intensity training. So we got one group to withhold any high intensity training from their program for 6 weeks. Another group, we gave them intervals to mix in with their training. And we found that the group that had no intensity didn't change their efficiency. The group that did have intensity improved their efficiency. And then when we removed the restrictions and allowed them to continue training for 6 weeks, they came back together. So the group that had the high intensity work withheld, then were able to reintroduce it, and their efficiency then improved and joined the group that had already been doing the interval. So it does look like intensity might be part of the key to changing efficiency over time.
Any more questions for Dr. Passfield? All right, let's thank them one more time to stop. All right, next week's speaker will be David Montero, and he'll be speaking on aerobic capacity in humans, importance of central and peripheral adaptations. See you next week, and help yourself to the coffee and cookies on the way out.